The morning sun cast long shadows across Maya's drafting table as she traced her finger along the final rendering of her most ambitious project yet. After 5 years of designing mundane office renovations and cookie-cutter suburban homes, she'd finally landed her breakthrough, a $4.2 million luxury residence for tech entrepreneur James Chen and his wife. Another late night. Mark's familiar voice carried across the open-plan office. He leaned against her desk, coffee in hand, his crisp navy suit a stark contrast to her rumpled blazer and messy bun. Maya forced a smile, trying to ignore how his cologne seemed to commandeer her workspace. "Worth every minute," she replied, straightening the sketches. "Mr. Chen approved the preliminary designs yesterday. We're moving forward with the full project." Mark's eyebrows shot up, his perfectly maintained smile flickering for just a moment. "Impressive. Though you might want to reconsider the cantilever on the east wing. Structural nightmare waiting to happen." Maya felt her jaw tighten. Mark had been with Bradford and Associates for 3 years longer than her, and never missed an opportunity to remind everyone. His helpful suggestions had become increasingly frequent since she'd landed the Chen contract. "The engineering team already signed off on it," she said, keeping her voice level. "It's actually one of the features Mr. Chen specifically requested." Of course." Mark raised his hands in mock surrender. "Just looking out for the firm's interests. You know how it is with first major projects, one mistake could set your career back years." His smile never reached his eyes. That evening, as Maya prepared for her presentation to the board, she noticed Mark lingering in the conference room with Mr. Chen. Their heads were bent close together, voices too low to hear. When she entered, they quickly separated, Mark's hand dropping from Chen's shoulder. "Maya." Chen greeted her warmly, though something felt off in his usual enthusiasm. Mark was just sharing some fascinating ideas about incorporating sustainable materials into the design. Was he? Maya's throat went dry. The sustainable materials had been her selling point, carefully researched and priced out over weeks of preparation. She hadn't shared those details with Mark. "Just spitballing," Mark said smoothly. "We're all on the same team here, right?" Over the next few weeks, Maya noticed Mark's team player attitude manifesting in unexpected ways. He began scheduling client meetings that overlapped with her presentations. Important emails arrived late or sometimes not at all. She found herself constantly explaining delays to Mr. Chen, while Mark seemed to always be one step ahead with solutions to problems she hadn't even encountered yet. The breaking point came during the foundation review. Maya arrived early to find Mark already in deep discussion with the contractors, gesturing at her blueprints spread across their truck hood. "These modifications will save you at least 8 weeks on the timeline," he was saying. "And the cost reduction is significant." "What modifications?" Maya demanded, her voice sharper than intended. The contractors exchanged uncomfortable glances. "Maya." Mark's surprise seemed practiced. "I was just reviewing some concerns about the foundation depth. Given the soil composition, I thought it prudent to suggest some adjustments." "The soil composition report isn't even finished yet," Maya said slowly, her pulse pounding in her ears. "And these aren't your blueprints to modify." "Now, Maya, let's not get territorial. Mr. Chen specifically asked for my input on the technical aspects. He's concerned about meeting deadlines, and frankly, your original timeline was optimistic." Maya felt the ground shift beneath her feet, and not because of any soil composition issues. When had Mr. Chen requested Mark's input? Why hadn't anyone informed her? She watched as Mark gathered her blueprints, her work, her vision, and tucked them into his leather portfolio with practiced ease. "We should discuss this back at the office," he said, his tone dripping with professional concern. "I have some thoughts on how we can salvage the situation." As Maya watched him walk away, greeting other contractors by name, a cold realization settled in her stomach. This wasn't just casual interference or professional rivalry. Mark wasn't trying to help, he was systematically undermining her position on the project. The question was, how far would he go, and what was his endgame? She pulled out her phone and began scrolling through weeks of emails and meeting notes, looking for patterns she'd missed. In her peripheral vision, she saw Mark's BMW pull away from the site, her blueprints riding shotgun. Something had to give, and soon. Maya just hoped she'd figure out his game before he completely destroyed everything she'd worked for. The moment Maya stepped into Bradford and Associates that morning, she knew something was wrong. The receptionist wouldn't meet her eyes. Two junior architects quickly scattered as she approached the break room. Even Janet, her usually chatty cubicle neighbor, seemed intensely focused on her computer screen. Maya's suspicions deepened when she found her office door locked. She'd never had a locked office before, she'd never even been issued a key. A fresh nameplate gleamed on the door, Mark Davidson, Senior Project Architect. Her breath caught in her throat as she read it again. This had been her office since landing the Chin contract. She'd spent countless nights here, surrounded by her sketches and models. The same sketches and models that were now visible through the glass, rearranged on shelves she didn't recognize. "Ah, Maya." Mark's voice carried down the hallway like a death knell. "I was hoping to catch you before the morning meeting." He approached with that same practiced smile, keys jingling casually in his hand. "We need to talk about the Chin residence." "My office," Maya managed through clenched teeth. "Why are you in my office?" "About that." Mark's smile didn't waver. "There have been some organizational changes. Mr. Chin expressed concerns about the project's direction, and the board felt it needed more experienced oversight." The floor seemed to tilt beneath Maya's feet. "What are you talking about?" "I spoke with Mr. Chin 3 days ago. Everything was on track." "Was it?" Mark unlocked the door, gesturing for her to enter what had once been her space. "Because that's not what the contract says." He pulled a document from his desk now, and slid it across the surface. Maya's hands shook as she picked it up. It was the Chin contract, but not the version she remembered signing. This one listed Mark Davidson as lead architect, with Maya Reynolds relegated to project support staff. "This isn't right," she whispered. "This isn't the original contract." "It's the only contract that matters," Mark replied, his tone sympathetic but his eyes cold. "The one Mr. Chin signed yesterday. He had concerns about your experience level, Maya. Perfectly understandable for a project of this magnitude. I simply offered to step in and ensure everything runs smoothly." "You're lying." Maya's voice rose, drawing glances from passing colleagues. "I designed every inch of this house. The sustainable materials, the cantilever, the foundation specs, those were all my ideas." "Ideas you developed while working for Bradford and Associates," Mark reminded her smoothly. "Using firm resources, firm contacts. The intellectual property belongs to the firm, and the firm has decided I'm better qualified to execute the vision." Maya felt sick. All those lingering meetings with Mr. Chen, the delayed emails, the contractor conversations, Mark had been laying the groundwork for weeks, maybe months. She'd been so focused on the design, she'd missed the political maneuvering happening right under her nose. "I'll fight this," she declared, her hands balling into fists. "I'll go to the board. I'll talk to Mr. Chin directly." The board signed off on this yesterday. Mark's smile finally faded, replaced by something harder. "And Mr. Chin? He's not interested in office politics, Maya. He wants results, stability, experience. Face it, you're not ready for a project of this scale. The sooner you accept that, the easier this transition will be." "Transition?" Maya's laugh held no humor. "You stole my project." "I protected the firm's interests," Mark corrected. "Your emotional reaction right now? This is exactly why the board agreed with my assessment. You're not mature enough to handle this level of responsibility." Maya opened her mouth to argue further, but movement in the hallway caught her attention. Mr. Chen himself was being led to the conference room, flanked by two board members. He glanced her way, then quickly looked away, his expression uncomfortable. "If you'll excuse me," Mark said, straightening his tie, "I have a client meeting to attend. Janet can help you move your things to the third-floor workspace. We'll talk more about your new support role once things settle down." Maya stood frozen as Mark brushed past her, joining the group in the conference room. Through the glass walls, she watched as they exchanged handshakes and warm greetings. Her project materials, her dreams, still surrounded her, but they might as well have been in another universe. As she finally turned to leave, a piece of paper fluttered from the contract onto the floor. Bending to retrieve it, she noticed something odd about the signature page. The date looked smudged. And the paper stock seemed different from the rest of the document. Maya's mind raced. In her shock, she'd accepted Mark's version of events, but what if there was more to the story? What if Mr. Chen hadn't willingly signed this contract? What if Mark's perfect coup wasn't as perfect as he thought? She slipped the signature page into her pocket, her heart pounding. Mark might have outmaneuvered her professionally, but if there was even a hint of fraud involved, well, two could play at the game of gathering evidence. The question was, how far was she willing to go to expose the truth? The third-floor workspace felt like exile. Maya sat at her new desk, surrounded by junior architects fresh out of college, all of them stealing glances when they thought she wasn't looking. The whispers followed her everywhere, how she'd cracked under pressure, how Mark had saved the Chen project, how she should be grateful the firm kept her on at all. But Maya wasn't listening to gossip. She was watching. Waiting. Building her case piece by careful piece. The signature page from Mark's fraudulent contract had been just the beginning. Over the next 2 weeks, Maya meticulously documented every inconsistency she could find. Late at night, long after most employees had gone home, she combed through archived emails, project files, and meeting minutes. She photographed original sketches, recorded dates, and built a timeline of Mark's interference. "You shouldn't be here," a quiet voice said one evening. Maya jumped, nearly dropping her phone. Janet stood in the doorway of the records room, her expression unreadable in the dim light. "Janet, Maya began, but her former cubicle neighbor held up a hand. "I'm not blind, Maya. None of us are." Janet glanced over her shoulder before stepping into the room and closing the door. "We've all seen how Mark operates. You're not the first person he's managed out of his way." Maya's heart raced. "What do you mean?" Janet sighed, settling onto a filing cabinet. 3 years ago, there was an architect named David Collins. Brilliant designer, landed the Riverside Plaza project. Mark was his mentor, supposedly helping him navigate his first big commercial deal. She paused, picking at her nail polish. 2 months in, David had a mental breakdown. Left architecture altogether. Now he teaches high school art in Wisconsin. What happened? Same pattern. Missing emails. Changed meetings. Irregular contract amendments. By the time David realized what was happening, Mark had convinced everyone, including the client, that David was unstable, unreliable. Janet met Maya's eyes. "Sound familiar?" Maya's throat tightened. Why didn't anyone say anything? Mark's connected. His father plays golf with half the board. His sister's married to our biggest developer client. Even if someone proved he was sabotaging projects, the firm would probably bury it to avoid scandal. Janet stood, straightening her skirt. "But you didn't hear any of this from me." As Janet reached for the door, Maya called out, "Wait. Why are you telling me now?" "Because Mark made a mistake with you," Janet said quietly. "He got sloppy. Overconfident. And..." She hesitated. "Mr. Chen was in yesterday. He didn't look happy with whatever Mark was showing him. Started asking questions about the original design concepts. Maya's pulse quickened. Questions about what? The sustainable materials primarily. Apparently, Mark's modifications doubled the environmental impact and added 30% to the budget. Mr. Chen's whole brand is built on green technology. He's not pleased. Janet opened the door but paused in the threshold. Oh, and Maya. Check the permit applications. Mark backdated some things, but he couldn't change the city's timestamps. After Janet left, Maya sat in the darkness, her mind racing. She pulled up the city's building permit website, remembering her login from the initial application. Sure enough, there they were, dozens of modification requests filed under Mark's name, but with timestamps that proved he'd been working to undermine her project long before he claimed Mr. Chen had concerns. The next morning, Maya arrived early to find her new desk occupied by a massive flower arrangement. The card read, "My deepest apologies for your current situation. Not everyone appreciates true vision. J.C." Maya stared at Mr. Chen's initials, a plan forming in her mind. Mark might have the board in his pocket, but he'd overlooked something crucial, the client's actual needs. If Mr. Chen was already questioning Mark's changes, maybe he'd be interested in other discrepancies as well. She reached for her phone, then stopped. Mark undoubtedly monitored her work email, probably her personal one too. She needed a secure way to communicate with Mr. Chen, to show him everything she'd discovered without tipping her hand to Mark. As if on cue, her phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number, having permit issues with recent modifications. Need to discuss original sustainability specs. Dinner. James Chen. Maya's hands shook as she saved the number. This was her chance, but she had to be careful. Mark had already proven he could twist any situation to his advantage. She needed more than just evidence of his deception, she needed an airtight case that even his country club connections couldn't dismiss. The question was, could she build it before Mark realized she was fighting back? And more importantly, who else might step out of the shadows to help or hinder her quest for justice? She glanced at the flowers again, noticing something odd about the arrangement. Mixed in with the exotic blooms was a single sprig of rosemary, the exact herb she proposed for the Chen residence's rooftop garden, a detail that hadn't made it into any official documents. Mr. Chen was sending her a message, he remembered the original design, and he wanted it back. Maya allowed herself a small smile as she opened her bottom drawer, pulling out the files she'd been gathering. Mark thought he'd buried her in the third-floor exile, too junior and inexperienced to fight back. He was about to learn just how dangerous it was to underestimate someone with nothing left to lose. The upscale restaurant buzzed with evening activity as Maya sat across from James Chen, her manila folder of evidence resting between them like a loaded weapon. She'd chosen her outfit carefully, the same charcoal suit she'd worn when pitching the original design, her hair pulled back severely. She needed to look professional, controlled, despite the storm raging inside her. "These modifications," Chen said, sliding back the construction plans, "they're not what we discussed. Not what I agreed to." His fingers drummed against his water glass, a nervous tell she remembered from their initial meetings. "Mark claimed you requested the changes," Maya replied carefully. "That you had concerns about my experience level." Chen's laugh held no humor. "Ms. Reynolds, I chose your design precisely because it wasn't typical. The sustainable materials, the integrated green spaces, that vision aligned perfectly with my company's ethos. Now I'm looking at generic luxury features that could be in any McMansion in the city." Maya's heart raced. This was her opening. "Mr. Chen, there's something you need to see." She opened the folder, revealing the evidence she'd gathered. "The contract Mark showed you wasn't the original." He dash. The restaurant's door chimed. Maya's words died in her throat as she saw Mark stride in, his timing too perfect to be coincidence. He spotted them immediately, his practiced smile spreading across his face as he approached their table. "Mr. Chen." "Maya." "What a delightful surprise." Mark pulled up a chair without waiting for an invitation. "I hope you don't mind my joining you. When I saw Maya leave the office with our project files, I thought I should supervise." The last word carried a threat. Maya's hands clenched under the table as Mark smoothly took control of the conversation, steering it away from her evidence and toward his revised plans. But something was off about his usual charm offensive. His smile seemed strained, his jokes a bit too loud. "Actually, Mark," Chen interrupted, "Maya was just explaining some discrepancies in the contract." Mark's smile flickered. "All perfectly normal adjustments, I assure you. Though I'm concerned about Maya's involvement at this point. Given her emotional state." "Emotional state?" Maya started to protest, but Mark spoke over her. "The board wanted me to wait until tomorrow to announce this, but since we're all here." He reached into his briefcase. "Maya, you're being transferred to our Seattle office. The board feels a fresh start would be best for everyone." The room seemed to tilt. "Seattle? You can't dash. It's already arranged. Your flight leaves Sunday." Mark's voice dripped with false sympathy. "Think of it as an opportunity. Smaller projects, less pressure. More suited to your current capabilities." "This is ridiculous," Chen began, but Mark smoothly cut him off too. "Mr. Chen, I apologize for this scene. Maya's behavior recently has been concerning. Showing up at your dinner, making accusations." He slid a document across the table. "The board drafted this statement, addressing her removal from the project and explaining the necessary changes to the original design." Maya stared at the paper, her vision blurring. The statement painted her as unstable, incompetent, possibly even dangerous to the project's success. It was character assassination wrapped in corporate language, and it had the full weight of Bradford and Associates behind it. "If you'll just sign here," Mark continued, offering Chen a pen, "we can put this unfortunate situation behind us and move forward with the improved designs." Chen's hand wavered over the document. Maya watched, helpless, as months of work, years of dreams, teetered on the edge of destruction. Then she saw it, the same smudged signature style she'd noticed on the fraudulent contract. "Mr. Chen," she said quickly, her voice steadier than she felt, "before you sign that, could you tell me when you approved the foundation changes? The ones dated March 15th. Mark's head snapped up, but Maya pressed on. "Because I have footage from your Singapore office showing you in meetings there all that week." "Which means someone else signed those approvals. Someone who's been forging your signature on multiple documents." The pen froze inches above the paper. Chen's eyes narrowed as he looked between Maya and Mark. "What is she talking about?" "She's desperate," Mark said quickly, but sweat beaded on his forehead. "Making wild accusations dash. Am I?" Maya pulled out her phone, bringing up the video she'd retrieved from Chen's corporate communications team. This aired on Channel 5 Business News. "You're clearly visible in the background during your company's green energy announcement. On the exact day you supposedly signed documents here in Chicago." The silence that followed felt endless. Chen slowly set down the pen, his expression hardening as he turned to Mark. "Is this true?" "Mr. Chen, I can explain dash." "Can you explain this too?" Maya placed printed emails on the table, dozens of them, showing Mark's systematic dismantling of her original design, his backdated permits, his fraudulent approvals. He's been forging signatures and modifying documents for months. And not just on this project. Mark's charm evaporated. "You vindictive little dash," he reached for the evidence, but Chen's hand slammed down on the papers first. "Don't," Chen said quietly, his voice carrying more menace than a shout. "Don't make this worse for yourself." Maya watched as Mark's carefully constructed world began to crumble. But even as satisfaction bloomed in her chest, a cold voice in her head whispered a warning: Mark was cornered now. And cornered men were capable of anything. The look he gave her as he stood confirmed her fears. This wasn't over. Mark might be exposed, but he still had the board's support, still had his family connections. He'd find a way to spin this, to shift the blame, to destroy her professional reputation so thoroughly that no firm would ever hire her again. Unless she had one more card to play. Her hand slipped into her pocket, fingers brushing against a final piece of evidence she'd almost been afraid to use. Sometimes, she realized, the only way to win against someone like Mark was to be willing to burn everything down, including yourself. The Bradford and Associates office hummed with tension the next morning. Mark hadn't shown up, a first in his immaculate attendance record. Maya sat at her third-floor desk, watching the whispered conversations and furtive glances surrounding her. Everyone knew something had happened, but no one had the full story. Yet. Her phone buzzed, another message from Janet. Board emergency meeting at 2 p.m. Mark's father flew in from Palm Springs. Maya checked the time, 10:30 a.m. 3.5 hours to set everything in motion. Her hand trembled slightly as she reached for the bottom drawer of her desk, removing a thick manila envelope she'd prepared months ago, long before the Chen project, back when she'd first noticed Mark's pattern of behavior. "You shouldn't be here," a quiet voice said. Maya looked up to find David Collins, her predecessor, the architect Mark had driven to Wisconsin, standing by her desk. He looked older than his LinkedIn photo, his designer glasses replaced by practical frames, his once trendy haircut grown out into a teacher's conservative style. "Janet called you," Maya said. It wasn't a question. David nodded, pulling up a chair. "I've been following the Chen project news. Sustainable design, innovative use of space, it had your fingerprints all over it. Then suddenly, Mark Davidson takes over due to client concerns." He shook his head. "Same playbook he used on me. Why did you never fight back?" Maya asked, though she thought she knew the answer. "Fight with what?" Mark covered his tracks perfectly. Every changed document, every missed meeting, he had explanations for everything. The only person who knew the truth was his assistant, and she vanished, Maya finished. Took a job in London suddenly, right? Except she didn't. Maya pulled a document from her envelope. She never left Chicago. She's been working under a different name, at a small architecture firm in Wicker Park. And she kept everything. David's eyes widened as he read the statement in his hands, a notarized confession from Mark's former assistant, detailing years of document falsification, forged signatures, and systematic sabotage of rising architects who threatened Mark's position. "How did you find her?" "I didn't," Maya admitted. "She found me. The day Mark took over my office, I received an anonymous email with her contact information. Apparently, she's been watching Mark's career, waiting for someone willing to stand up to him." David let out a low whistle. This would destroy him. "But Maya." He hesitated. "Mark's family practically owns this firm. Even with this evidence, they'll close ranks. Protect their own." "I'm counting on it," Maya said, her voice steady. "That's why I sent copies of everything to the state licensing board this morning. And the FBI's Financial Crimes Division." "The FBI? What dash?" "Mark wasn't just stealing projects," Maya explained, pulling out more documents. "He was taking kickbacks from contractors, forcing them to use suppliers owned by shell companies registered to his home address. The Chen project modifications? They would have funneled millions through his fake supply chain." David stared at her, realization dawning. "That's why you waited. You needed him to try the same play on a project big enough to trigger federal attention." "The Chen residence was perfect," Maya agreed. "High-profile client, major sustainability claims, significant public interest. Once Mark started changing suppliers, the paper trail led straight to his other schemes. Her phone buzzed again, another text from Janet. "Mark's here. Looks scared. Heading to boardroom." Maya stood, gathering her files. "I need to go. The board meeting's been moved up." "What are you going to do?" "Give Mark exactly what he wants, a chance to destroy me in front of the board." She smiled grimly. "Of course, I invited some other interested parties to the meeting. The state licensing board investigator should be here any minute. And those FBI agents? They're very interested in hearing Mark explain his supplier selection process." David caught her arm as she turned to leave. "Maya, wait. What you're doing, it's not just about the Chen project anymore, is it?" "No," she said softly. "It's about every David Collins out there. Every architect whose dreams got sacrificed to Mark's ambition." She patted the envelope under her arm. "Sometimes the only way to stop a bully is to show everyone who they really are." As Maya walked toward the boardroom, she felt oddly calm. Mark had taught her well, though not in the way he'd intended. He'd shown her how to gather evidence, how to build a case, how to wait for the perfect moment to strike. Now she would show him how it felt to watch everything you'd built crumble around you. Her phone buzzed one final time. FBI agents in lobby. State investigator already here. Board members looking nervous. Maya took a deep breath, squaring her shoulders. The last piece of her plan was the riskiest. She had to give Mark enough rope to hang himself, had to let him think he was winning one last time. Because men like Mark Davidson didn't fall quietly. They raged and fought and tried to take everyone down with them. She pushed open the boardroom door, feeling all eyes turn to her. Mark sat at the far end, his usual polished appearance slightly frayed. His father stood behind him, hand on his shoulder, the picture of paternal support. The board members filled the remaining seats, their expressions ranging from concerned to hostile. "Ms. Reynolds," the board chairman began, "given the circumstances Actually," Maya interrupted politely, "I believe we should wait for the other attendees. They're very interested in hearing what Mr. Davidson has to say about the Chen project." Among others. The elevator dinged in the distance. Mark's face went pale as he recognized the heavy footsteps approaching, the unmistakable sound of federal agents about to crash a party. Maya settled into a chair, allowing herself a small smile. The game was over. Mark just didn't know it yet. The boardroom crackled with tension as two FBI agents entered, followed by a stern-faced woman from the state licensing board. Maya watched as Mark's carefully constructed facade began to crack, his eyes darting between the new arrivals and his father's increasingly thunderous expression. "What is the meaning of this?" the elder Davidson demanded, his golf course tan darkening to an angry red. "This is a private meeting This is now a federal investigation," the lead agent interrupted, placing his credentials on the table. "We have evidence of systematic fraud, contract manipulation, and financial crimes involving multiple projects at Bradford and Associates." Mark leaped to his feet. "This is ridiculous. Maya's obviously fabricated Mr. Davidson," the licensing board investigator cut in, "we've been monitoring your activities for months. Ms. Reynolds merely provided the final pieces of a puzzle we'd already largely assembled." The board members exchanged alarmed glances as the agent began laying out documents, bank statements, shell company registrations, contractor kickback receipts. Maya watched as Mark's father sank into a chair, his influence and connections useless against the weight of federal evidence. "Perhaps," Mark said, his voice shaking slightly, "there have been some irregularities in our supplier relationships. But that's hardly Irregularities?" Maya couldn't stay silent any longer. She stood, facing the man who tried to destroy her career. "You didn't just manipulate supplies, Mark. You destroyed people. David Collins. Sarah Chen from the Phoenix office. Thomas Rodriguez in Miami. How many careers did you sabotage to maintain your position? The room fell silent as Maya placed her own evidence on the table, the former assistant's confession, statements from contractors forced into Mark's kickback scheme, emails proving his systematic destruction of other architects' work. You really think anyone will believe you? Mark sneered, but his voice lacked conviction. A junior architect having a mental breakdown, making wild accusations. That's where you're wrong, a new voice said from the doorway. James Chen stepped into the room, followed by 3 members of his company's legal team. We believe her completely. And we're prepared to testify about the forged signatures, the fraudulent contract modifications, and the attempt to force us into using your overpriced, substandard suppliers. Mark's face went ashen. Dad, he whispered, turning to his father for help, but the elder Davidson was already moving away, conferring urgently with the board chairman. Mark Davidson, the FBI agent, said formally, "You're under arrest for fraud, forgery, and financial crimes crossing state lines. You have the right to remain silent." Maya watched as they led Mark away, his designer suit wrinkled, his careful persona shattered. The board members huddled in corners, whispering frantically about damage control. Chen's lawyers were already discussing settlement terms for the project delays. Ms. Reynolds. The board chairman approached her, his expression a mixture of embarrassment and calculation. Obviously, in light of these developments, we'd like to reinstate you as lead architect on the Chen residence. With a substantial raise, of course. Maya looked around the room, at the powerful men who'd enabled Mark's behavior, at the system that had protected him for so long. Actually, she said clearly, I have a better offer. She turned to James Chen, who smiled and nodded. Maya will be joining Chen Innovations as our new director of sustainable architecture, he announced. She'll be overseeing not just her original residential design, but our entire portfolio of green building projects. The chairman's face fell as Maya gathered her belongings. On her way out, she paused by Janet's desk. Thank you, she said softly. For everything. Janet smiled. You did all the hard work. I just helped Karma along a little. Later that evening, Maya stood at the Chen residence construction site, watching the sunset paint the partially completed structure in shades of gold. Her phone buzzed with messages, congratulations from colleagues, interview requests from architecture magazines, even a thank you note from David Collins. But it was the last message that made her smile the widest, a group photo from the Wisconsin high school where David taught, showing him with his art students, their faces bright with creative passion. Sometimes losing one dream leads you to a better one, he'd written. But sometimes fighting for what's right changes everything. Maya looked up at the building taking shape before her, her vision, her design, restored to its original sustainable glory. In the end, Mark had taught her something valuable. True architecture wasn't just about creating beautiful spaces. It was about building with integrity, about standing up for your principles, about creating something that would inspire others long after you were gone. She pulled out her phone and typed a quick reply to David, teaching Monday's class about sustainable design. I've got some real-world examples they might find interesting. The sun dipped below the horizon as Maya walked to her car, her steps light. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, a new job, new projects, new opportunities to make a difference. But tonight, she had won something more valuable than any contract. She had won back her voice, her vision, and her right to shape the future of architecture on her own terms. As she drove away, the Chen residence stood silhouetted against the darkening sky, no longer just a building, but a monument to perseverance, to justice, and to the power of standing up against those who would steal your dreams. Maya smiled, knowing that somewhere in a federal holding cell, Mark Davidson was finally learning the hardest lesson of all: some buildings, like some truths, simply couldn't be corrupted, no matter how hard you tried.